Hi class, we're going to be talking about Japanese art today. So I wanted to start with a map, just to ground us where we are looking. We talked about China and Korea last week, and I want to show on the map, clearly geographically speaking, we have this close relationship between China, Korea, and Japan. So artistically speaking, it's going to make sense that we are seeing overlapping traditions and influences. But of course, Japan is an island nation, right? So it is going to have its own styles, its own traditions. And I want to focus on that while also giving a nod to the influences coming from mainland China and Korea as well. All right. So when we talk about Japanese art and Japan historically speaking, as I said, Japan is an island nation, so it's independent in a lot of ways because it's, isolated. And historically speaking, for a really long time, Japan had trading relations and political relationships with Korea as well as China. But it got to a point where there was a specific political decision made to become a completely isolationist country, meaning that Japan locked down its borders, did very little trade. There was a little bit of a relationship with the Dutch, but really no influences coming in or out of Japan for a significant amount of time from 1603 to 1850. This is known as Sakoku, the Sakoku period, which is translates to like a chained or locked nation. Eventually, the US military came in and essentially said that they had to start trading. And so then they opened up, and we don't cover this in chronologically this time period in class of when they do open up, but it is a really fascinating time to talk about how Japanese art becomes really influential and inspirational for artists in Europe and the United States because they didn't really have Japanese art at that point, and then all of a sudden they have all this Japanese art. Anyways, that is beyond the scope of this particular class. But I do want to focus on when we're talking about religious tradition, a lot of Japanese art is going to be influenced from Shintoism. Shintoism is sort of like a bigger umbrella term for this idea of a collection of native beliefs and mythologies that are about connecting to gods and spirits that are found in nature. So really, this is going to have regional specific, regionally specific traditions. So if you ever go to Japan, it's actually really common to find like little mini temples in nature all the time as sort of a nod to the spirituality found within nature. We're also going to see a lot of influence from Buddhism, and we'll talk a lot about that as well. Specifically, Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is going to be a version of Buddhism that really focuses on Zen practices. So the idea of doing things that are meditative and introspective, tea ceremonies, ikebana, bonsai. These we're going to talk about all of those more specifically, but really those are all traditions that are meant to focus on kind of clearing your mind, meditation, focusing just on being reflective. Other themes included in Zen Buddhism are austerity, endurance, and loyalty. So this idea of paring down, sort of minimalist. We'll see examples of that. A lot of the art that we're going to see is from artisans, which is similar to China, but we do see, similar to China, this idea that aristocrats are also interested in creating artworks as a form of meditation, as a form of spiritual practice, not just something that, oh, you do it because it's fun or you want to make money, but this idea specifically that you can do these practices, these artistic practices, these creative practices, and they will actually lead you to spiritual enlightenment. So a lot of the things we're going to be seeing again are going to have influences in terms of, materials and art subjects. We're going to see a lot of landscapes. We will see narratives, and we'll talk about that as well, and a lot of incorporation of nature. Some of the main types of painting or artwork, excuse me, we're going to see are emaki, which are narrative scrolls. Again, if you go back to our unit on China, we saw this idea of hanging scrolls and hand scrolls and how that was an important medium. We'll see some examples of that. Woodblock prints become really important. I wish we had more time to talk about woodblock prints. Woodblock printing is something that is really going to explode. Um, after Japan opens up, that becomes extremely popular in the West. But again, chronologically, in the scope of this class, we're not going to cover that. But wood block printing is extremely important in terms of artistic production in Japan. Tea houses, gardens, and palaces, we're going to talk about some examples of those as well. So let's get into it. This is really quickly, I just wanted to show this as well. This is a timeline of Japan, giving a sense of sort of like the division of periods of time, sort of like dynasties that we saw in China, but it's a little bit different because it's not just about who's ruling at this time, it's sort of the broader political structures that are in place, and these are bigger periods of time. So I might refer to some of these periods as we are talking about works, just to give you a sense of, what this timeline looks like. All right, we're going to look at our first work of Japanese art. We're going to go sort of back in time in terms of kind of the chronology we've been following recently. This object is from about 1400 BCE, so it's, a little older. The period of time this comes from is going to be associated as more of like a prehistoric civilization because we don't have a written record associated. And, that tells us that we don't have a text that's going to help explain this object, but we can still make a lot of good guesses based on what we're looking at. So I want you to look at this, spend some time answering these questions before we get too much into it, see what you can figure out on your own. So think about the details that are standing out to you in this figure. Think about the pose, the expression, the proportions that you see. Maybe think about the materials and the technique it took to make this. Um, One of the most prominent features of this object are the goggle eyes. That's going to tell us a lot, going to give us a lot of insight into what we're looking at. So maybe think about why that might be such a prominent feature of this figure, and maybe think about the function of this object. What do you think it was used for? So think about those things, and then we'll talk more specifically about it. To give you a little bit of a hint or an idea of what we're looking at, I thought it'd be appropriate to make this comparison. We talked about the Venus of Willendorf figure, which is an extremely old prehistoric art object. We talked about this as being like a fertility statue. There's conjecture about that because we have these in large breasts and enlarged genitalia, which are attributes of a female body that have connotations with fertility and supporting a child. When you're looking at this goggle-eyed figure, we have some of those elements as well, right? We have these exaggerated hips, we have breasts that are there's a focus on the breasts that are being specified here. So that's also going to give us some insight into what we're looking at. All right, so this is known as a goggle-eyed dogu. So a dogu is a type of sculpture, a type of figure that is found in prehistoric Japan. So the distinctive goggle-like eyes that you're seeing here have been interpreted as possibly being snow goggles because that is something that we know would have been used by people at this time when it was snowing to be able to like see. There's also ideas that this could be indicate maybe spiritual vision, this symbolic large eyes, if that makes sense, insight. We have very elaborate patterning on the body. So that tells you that design and decorative design is also extremely important, not just these, this is not meant to be just like a naturalistic depiction of a body, but also has design incorporated as well. We have it's a small figure with exaggerated hips, limbs, and breasts. The entire thing is hollow, and it was made through a coiling and incising technique, so the really early versions of ceramics. Found in Japan. We believe that this would have been maybe a fertility or healing figure that would have been used in rituals to be able to promote fertility or healing. And a lot of these figures have been found intentionally broken, which give the idea that maybe this is part of like a ritual or something. For example, this one in particular was found without a leg. So it's believed, maybe that the leg was broken off to signal like healing for a leg or something. I mean, that's just conjecture by scholars, but it also could be a female deity, a shamanistic figure, a fertility spirit. Again, this idea of goggles could be some sort of supernatural perception or protection, something along those lines. So this really lets us know that this is part of an animistic belief, this idea of belief in nature and the natural world. Uh, we see now the thing about the Dogu figures is like some of the other things we've seen, this is a type of sculpture that we're seeing. It's not just like one, but we're seeing this type created a couple different times, which lets us know that this was a type or something that was used by several people and presumably for similar purposes. It has become quite iconic within Japanese culture, just part of like this history of Japan. It's actually been incorporated in kind of other ways besides just being this object. It's been incorporated in postage stamps, museum exhibitions, and even video games. There's this video game Dragon Quest IV where they incorporate this figure that's meant to be like this clay doll, but clearly it's a direct reference to this Dogu figure, which is a kind of a cool way for modern Japanese artists to incorporate this like Japanese historical figure in a contemporary context. All right, we're going to look at our next couple of works. I wanted to really quickly talk about Zen Buddhism as this particular style of Buddhism that becomes really popular in Japan. Buddhism develops in the 5th century BCE in India, and then has this big influence in China, which eventually makes its way to Japan. And in Japan, Zen Buddhism which is a particular practice of Buddhism, becomes extremely popular, which is really a combination of Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism, and eventually became really popular worldwide. I mean, the word Zen, I'm sure you've heard that word before because that just kind of became part of vernacular of this idea of peace or enlightenment or whatever connotation it has now, and especially in the 20th century became really popular. So the idea of Zen is really about attempting to understand life without using like logical thought or language, but really through like meditation and seeking out peace and really becoming introspective and looking inward as opposed to looking outward for enlightenment. So that becomes important for artworks as well, because you're going to see some of these philosophies manifest in the work of art, but also understanding that art itself, the practice of creating a work of art and the way you make that art is a way of practicing these meditative beliefs as well. So let's see an example of that. I have this hanging scroll that I think is a great example of Zen Buddhist practice. So this is called Landscape from Bunzai's The Artist. This is from the Muromachi period. Now, Zen Buddhists sought enlightenment through meditation. The search for enlightenment need not extend beyond one's own mind. And the quote that is often associated with Buddhism is the ordinary mind is the way. So the ordinary mind, introspection is the way to enlightenment, detaching yourself from the world. I wanted to show a close-up. All right, here's a close-up of the landscape hanging scroll that I wanted to show you guys. Now, I want to really slowly go through this, and I want you to pay attention to the lines, the contrast between light and dark areas as we slowly go through this. And, you can look at the composition and, maybe if there's a narrative, but I think that there's less of focus on really a narrative or a story as opposed to a mood that's being conveyed. So I want you to think about that as we're looking at this. So here we get to the very base, which begins with this really the beginning of the landscape, right? This ground area, these rocks, these craggy rocks. It's ambiguous, right? Is it ground? Is there water here? It's ambiguous as to exactly what's here. And then we see the beginning of this tree forming these really beautiful horizontal branches extending out. And then we see some peaking of an architectural space and then a human figure. But again, not really a focus on the human. We know that there's a human here, but not really a focus on what they're doing and why they're there. They're really just looking out the window at nature, right? So you continue to see these rocks and you see more foliage and you see more of these really stark delineated lines, but then also hazier washes of ink here that you'll see. And one thing that I also think is extremely important for you to observe is how much negative space there is here, right? So just as much as we're seeing this positive space, the composition being portrayed, we also have a ton of negative space, a lot of empty space, and we'll talk more about exactly why that is in a second. So again, here, I mean, this is so much emptiness, empty space. And then here you have these really light washes of ink that are being shown. And then again, maybe these figures, maybe birds or something. We have more architecture. These could be figures. This is maybe an impression of a boat. You see these trees. Again, this is all very subtle. These mountains, it's this idea that you almost have this atmospheric perspective, like it's hazy. It's the impression of these mountains and these trees as opposed to really detailed impressions of these things, right? I feel like this is such a good example of what it could look like to have this philosophical perspective on a landscape. So let's talk about exactly what I mean by that. All right, going back to this landscape, when I am trying to get you to get this sense of this contrast between these like really subtle elements and these strong lines and these hazy areas and the negative space, I want you to think about Zen Buddhism and really the idea of what Zen Buddhism is, which is this idea of clearing your mind, meditation, peace, right? So when you're looking at something like this, it's not overly complicated, right? Like it's not filled top to bottom with stuff. There is room, literally physical negative space, room to think, to contemplate, to have ambiguity, to have space to open your mind and to clear things out, right? It's meant to be just this yeah, this peaceful space to focus on. The composition itself is fairly asymmetrical. And again, we're having this emphasis on emptiness, on space. The ink, I think, is also such an interesting medium to think about meditative practices. If any of you have ever used ink, you can think of ink in a couple different ways. So ink can be used like in a pen or something, which today the type of pens we use would have been really different to the type of ink that would have been used at this time. But ink typically you can use to make these really distinct, bold lines. But you can also use ink with water and make ink washes. And when you do an ink wash is a very light, almost like watercolor. It's very translucent. It's not going to be something that, is, the top of this painting, I think, is a really good example of that, of how sparse it can be and how you really just give these like impressions, and ink itself, if you think about ink and ink washes particularly, think about how ink operates on particularly something like paper. Like this is a paper, this medium is on paper, which means that if you think about ink on paper, ink has a tendency to kind of to spread out a little bit, right? Like there's a sense of control that you can have if you're very technically precise, but it does have a tendency that it does want to kind of spread out. So you think about that in terms of like a meditative practice, right? Like you have to have this really precise control while also allowing for things to breathe and to have room to move, and you have to be able to accommodate for that, right? It's like the world and your experience, right? You want control, but you have to go with the flow, right? Like there's this philosophical element to the whole experience. We have strong diagonal lines that lead you from the mountains to the rivers. And again, it's ambiguous. This middle area gives the impression to us that it's a water, that it's water, but we don't exactly know, which is interesting because water is in and of itself something, but it's shown just as empty space here. So again, we have these simple brushstroke with which describes the natural or suggests the natural forms as opposed to being like super precise and naturalistic. And we have these solid mountains in the void of the mists, and we have the solid architecture in the bottom. So yeah, reflective of these ideals of simplicity, harmony, and contemplation. Landscapes can be a place of spiritual journeys, and it's really about harmony with nature as opposed to dominance over it, right? Sort of similar to what we saw with the mountains and the streams. Travelers among the mountains and the streams from China or on China, there's a focus on nature here, right? There's certainly a presence of humans, but the humans are connected within nature as opposed to being dominant over nature. This is from the Morimachi period. This is a period of time that Zen influence was really at an apex. And there was also a significant amount of samurai patronage. This is a time where samurai warriors became really the elite class. And samurai warriors were people of political and military power, but they also had ideals connected to Buddhism, specifically Zen Buddhism. So they would have commissioned things like this and would have wanted these things in their spaces as evidence of their spiritual uh insight and their spirituality as opposed to just focusing on their like military and political power. So this is going to be very emblematic of a particular type of Japanese style that becomes really influential, very much influenced by Chinese types of art, but unique to this to Japan itself. All right, so our next Japanese work of art is The Night Attack on the Sanjo Palace. This is a narrative scroll, also known as an Emaki scroll. It's basically a hand scroll painting that you read from right to left and tells a story, sort of like a comic book. You're going to see a continuous narrative. We've talked about this idea of a continuous narrative before, but this idea that you'll see the same characters over and over again. It's not because there's multiple of them, it's just that you're following different moments across a period of time, and then you'll see a character sort of doing different things in different sections of the scroll. So when you think about it, a scroll is going to, again, I've talked about this, you unfurl it and you look at it section by section, and as you continue and unfurl more of it, then you will roll up the previous section. So you're really just looking a little bit at a time. There's a fantastic link that we're going to look at together to really hone in on some of the details, so you can see the narrative unfolding itself, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Just get a general sense of what narrative is being displayed here. We're actually looking at a story of this attack on the Sanjo Palace. It's the story of a coup that took place about 100 years before this scroll was made. There was basically various samurai groups that were competing at the time, and were, power was going between several samurai clans. And so there's a coup that takes place. Basically, these rebels come and enter a palace, kidnap the emperor who is there, kill a bunch of the people in the palace, and then make their way out. So really, the scroll is going to tell that story from the beginning, where we see sort of sparse, just a couple of people come in. It becomes more and more chaotic until you get to the palace. They break into the palace, and then you see a fire. It's even more chaotic. Then you have a lot of sort of bloody scenes, violence taking place, and then it starts to slowly dissipate after that. So you're really seeing, like a real event like this taking place. You have a quiet moment before the storm, then you have this chaotic moment, and then you have it sort of dissipate afterwards. So we're going to see that moving along as we look at the images. I have some close-ups here on the slides. I think it'll make more sense, and we'll be able to look at it bit by bit on the link. But these are just some close-ups to give you a sense of some of the stuff that we're going to see, and we'll see some really great a really great view of it with the link that I have. All right, I want to look at this scroll similar to how you would experience it as a hand scroll. So you start from right to left. You start with some text that's giving you context as to the story that you're looking at. It's talking about this night attack on the Sanjo Palace. So you have this text here that's telling the story, and then we start to see some figures. We start to see the beginning of spirit. We can get really close up here, which is pretty cool. So we have some figures who are slowly coming in. You can see weapons. You can see this animal pulling this palanquin to take these figures into the scene. So you have all of these people running in with on horseback, the samurai clan coming in. And as you continue onward, it becomes more and more chaotic, more people, right? Like this is really culminating in this big event. You can tell some of the figures are the leaders who are on horseback. We'll see some closer up as well. You have some more figures here, lots of archers. Some of the figures are so beautifully done and showing such acute emotion that I think is really interesting because you have so many figures here that it's hard to differentiate all of them. But you have a figure like this one on horseback, which looking back, sort of concern, right? Like this is probably a scary thing that they're participating in, a coup. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, right? So you have some more of these figures here, just a lot of chaos as they descend on the palace. And here you'll notice that there's this bunching up of people, and that's because there's essentially a moat on the outside of the palace. So they have to figure out a way to traverse the moat, this water element here. So they're trying to figure that out. And then the implication is that you continue to see figures on the other side, so they figure out a way to get across. And you see them all gathered here around the exterior of the palace, where they're going to break in and eventually set the whole place on fire. And you can see here, it's really fascinating. It's kind of hard to see, but if you look really, really close, you start to see these gray swirling clouds that give the sense of smoke. So you know that there's going to be a fire that takes place. So the idea is that you're sort of coming into the palace, but the idea is also that, there are people that will eventually go in and set it on fire and there will be smoke emanating out, right? So it's almost these like two stories happening at once. And if you look at this moment here, you can see at the very, very corner the beginnings of fire. You can see that the fire is going to be set off. So here's some more smoke on the outside. Here's a great blaze of fire. And one thing that I think is really cool is if you get so close, you can see that there's been this splatter technique used. So this idea of like you take the bristles of a brush and you kind of like flick the spatter, the splatters of paint onto the canvas to give it this, this quality of it that makes it look like fuzzy a little bit almost. And it also plays well when you get into the parts of like violence because that starts to look almost like blood, right? So it's violent, but it gives, the impression of what you're looking at. So here's the palace on fire. As you look in the lower portions, you can see the people attacking the figures on the interior. You see these women who are trying to escape. The palace trying to escape the attack basically. And so here's really the where the violence is ensuing and showing. You can look pretty closely and see that it's pretty graphic in terms of what exactly is happening. A lot of decapitation and stabbing and swords involved. You see these horses up here. You see the chaos of the flames. You have a figure hiding back here, trying to hide from the chaos and the violence. You can really get close, and if you have time, you can really spend so much time just really laser focusing on certain elements, and there's a lot there for each particular scene. More violence, chaos. I'm going to kind of zoom out here. I wanted to show this. I think this one is so interesting. You have these women who are fleeing and they're being dragged down by their heavy robes that are covered in blood. It's really conveying how horrific this experience would have been probably. Um, so there's all these other militant figures. You see heads on pikes. And then this is the scene of the people basically leaving the palace. They would have kidnapped the emperor, and the idea is that he probably would have been in this palanquin being transported away, to accomplish some negotiations that they end up performing later. And then you can see that the chaos starts to dissipate slowly. Um, and then you have you have this guy who's the head samurai warrior who would have been leading this charge, and then an archer, and then some more text at the very end of it. So we have this whole story being told. And again, it's just you can really hone in on just particular moments of the scene, but then you can also look and conceptualize the entire thing together, telling the story of this attack that took place. Now we're going to discuss some Japanese architecture. I wanted to show this slide again. We did look at this already during our unit on Chinese architecture, but I wanted to remind us about pagoda style and courtyard style architecture because this style of architecture becomes important in China and then makes its way to Japan, and Japan, evolves this style as well, and it eventually becomes characteristic of Japanese architecture. So we talked before about a pagoda. Pagoda is a style of architecture that extends its influence all the way back to the Buddhist stupa. So remember the stupa being this mound, oftentimes having pointing towards Buddha, like a site where Buddha was buried. And then eventually this becomes a little bit taller, and then eventually becomes this storied architectural structure, and then eventually becomes the pagoda style that we know today. Courtyard style architecture we've talked about a couple of times is a residential, oftentimes a residential space, but has been adapted to like palace complexes and temple complexes now as well. Typically you'll have some sort of interior space that's on the outside, and then a space that's in the middle that is exposed to the elements. So you have this space where you're technically outside, but it's on the inside, so there's privacy attached to it. And then eventually courtyard style architecture, depending on the architectural structure, can be expanded upon. You have, multiple courtyards, and then, lots of different areas where rooms and things like that can be built on added on top of that. So the structure we're going to be looking at is this one here. This is considered the most important Buddhist temple in Japan. This is known as the Todaichi, or Great Eastern Temple. It is at its zenith, or basically when it was the biggest it ever was, it was considered the largest Buddhist temple in Japan. And it is still the largest wooden architectural structure in the world, which is pretty impressive. So this was originally built around 550 CE. That's when the beginning of the construction started on this temple. This is really when the imperial court became synonymous with Buddhism. They had Buddhism part of political life. So they built this big structure, and later, over several centuries, this structure became really symbolic of a unifier for the country, because they relied on everyday people to donate materials to the construction of this temple. So it's the largest wooden building in the world. It is undressed wood, meaning that in the construction of it, they didn't do a ton of painting on top of it, which gives it this sense of natural, like the natural connection, right? Like it makes you think of nature connecting to the material that was used to build it, right? It's pointing you in the direction of nature when you're looking at it. And the interesting thing about it is that it took so much natural wood, particularly cypress, which was the primary wood that they used for the structure. It used so much of the natural wood around it that eventually it burned down, and or parts of it burned down. And when it burned down, which of course a wooden structure is prone to being destroyed like that, because it's, wood burns quite easily. So when that happened, and when they wanted to reconstruct it, they could not reconstruct it to its original size, because they had depleted their own natural cypress sources so severely that they just didn't have enough wood even available to them to rebuild it, which is a kind of crazy idea. So again, the architecture is meant to harmonize with the environment. It's meant to not be like this separate space from the environment, but to integrate itself into the environment. It's known as the Great Eastern Temple because it's located on the eastern side of Nara, which is the city that this is located. And it once was the capital of Japan. So you have these like political associations with the religion of Buddhism. Toreichi is also famous for housing a massive Vairocana Buddha. So we've talked about the Vairocana Buddha as being this universal Buddha. So I have a picture of it that we'll look at, but it's a massive Buddha sculpture that people can come and worship and, make offerings to and things like that. So I mentioned that this was razed to the ground. It was burned down during a civil war in 1200 CE. And when it was rebuilt, they rebuilt it much smaller because of the shortage of cypress at the time. So the top picture is the Great Buddha Hall. So basically this entire thing is a complex, right? It's not just one building. So that one building that we have right here is the Great Buddha Hall. It's not the entire thing. But what you're looking at the bottom picture is the Nandaimon, which is the Great South Gate. So this is sort of like the entryway that you see when you come in. We have this elaborate wood bracketing system that is being incorporated here that they actually were influenced from Korean architecture. Very, very thick pillars to be able to support the roof here, but there's no ceiling, so the roof is exposed. It gives us this sense of height and how tall it is. Again, undressed wood, quite natural looking. And this was actually built after the temple burned down. Here are some of the sculptures that are located in the Great Buddha Temple. So on the left, we're seeing Neo-Guardian figures. I wonder if they look familiar to you at all. I hope they do. They're meant to look like the Vajrapani figures from the Longmen Caves, which we talked about when we talked about China. Those are you had the Longmen Caves, which had the Buddha figure and the several other figures that would radiate outward from it. And the Vajrapani figures are these like guardian figures, and they are on either side of the entryway when you come into this temple. So they're sort of like guardians of the Buddha sculpture. The wooden sculptures of the Neo-Guardian figures are over 26 feet tall, with joined wood block construction. So they didn't find some like tree that was this size and then carve it out. They took several different pieces and carved them to be put together. The construction of this was in the 1200s, and this was during the Kamakura era, which was a pretty militaristic society. So there have been scholars that have said that this is sort of indicative of that era. So on the bottom, we have the Daibutsu, or also known as the Great Buddha. This is the largest metal statue of Buddha in the entire world. It is 50 feet tall. It's massive. It took all available copper in Japan to create this sculpture, which is crazy. And so when I mentioned before that this was seen as almost like a unifying project. The idea is that everybody was donating and giving their copper to support the construction of this as a way of showing this fealty to Buddhism and that is becoming part of the political structure, and as a way to show like sacrifice on the part of the citizens to all come together to create this. So it was done through a tax system, but it was meant to be this unifying demonstration of their belief. Also, obviously, a demonstration of the emperor's power that he's able to pull that off. The mudras, or the hand symbols that you see on the Buddha, are meant to signify do not fear and welcome. It's really hard to see one of them because there's like these sculptures sort of in front, but you can see that this one in front, which is basically do not fear. Then the other one sort of in this hand, which means welcome. Here are a couple other pictures just to give you a sense of what this looks like. I like the one on the left because you can see the size of the Daibutsu. So it's massive, this massive metal sculpture of the Buddha. You also see the wood bracketing system. Again, this is Korean in inspiration. And then this diagram at the bottom is also really interesting because it shows the construction of the original temple in comparison to what survived. So all of the places that you see there that are in like dark black are the things that survived or that they reconstructed. So those are the existing structures. And then the original structure are all the sort of lighter outlined areas. So you can see that the complex, which was much, much, much larger, but then because it was destroyed and they didn't have enough resources to rebuild it to its full scale, that's why it looks like this now. All right, we're going to look at our last architectural structure in our unit on Japan. This is the Ryoanji, which translates to the Peaceful Dragon Temple. So similar to the other temples we've looked at, this does connect to Buddhism, but it's a kind of a different type of worship style. This is going to be a place that is more focused on meditation and promoting meditative practices. The structure itself was designed specifically for elite Japanese Buddhists. This is a place where people can come and they can like pay some money and be able to stay in this Zen center. I feel like there's actually places that replicate this kind of idea in the West, like in the United States and in Europe. They do things to replicate this idea of having like a Zen garden, a Zen place. So the entirety of the complex is meant to promote experiences of meditation and give you microcosms of nature and of the universe. And I'll kind of show you what I mean by that. So Zen Buddhism derived from Chan Buddhism, and it really focuses on this idea of meditation to receive enlightenment. So it's really about finding peaceful places, places to connect to nature, being introspective, being contemplative as a means of elevating yourself and enlightening yourself. This one in particular also this place or this style of Buddhism also incorporates Shintoism because there's this idea that if you worship in nature that you can um, also receive enlightenment. So there's this connection between these different practices. So a Zen dry garden is essentially like a diorama that's meant to be like a microcosm. And so a dry garden is typically going to be these larger rocks arranged in this garden, like rock garden structure. So you have these like tiny rocks, which are like the lighter grain than these bigger rocks. And the entirety of the garden is meant to replicate natural like features of different types of like natural elements. So let me give you an example. So you could sorry. So you could imagine when you're looking at this bottom picture where you have these large rocks and then these like lighter gray rocks, it could be, you know, mountains and islands coming up from a big ocean, right? It could be mountains coming from a big plain and this is like land in between. It could also look like stars in a sky and then the gray the lighter gray is the sky area, right? So it could be really any of those things, interpreted to be any of those things. So the grouping that we're seeing here is you're not really supposed to see all of it from one angle. There's not like one right way to look at it. It's meant to be something that you can experience by walking around it. There are also people who participate in like dry garden like care. So basically the idea of like taking like a rake and putting lines into the gravel as a meditative practice, as something that requires your full focus, your full concentration as a meditative act. There's also wet gardens. So the idea is that you just have like trees and water elements and bridges and all of these things that put you into nature, put you into these contemplative spaces, really immerse yourself in nature. And the arrangement of the plants that they have, they really try to make this an evergreen garden. So any time of year you go, there's something that's flourishing at that time. And that takes a lot of planning and organization to be able to put something like that together. There's also architectural structures that allow for like tea ceremonies and other Zen practices. On this page, I have a picture of the Golden Pavilion, which is where some of the tea ceremonies happen. And again, this putting together a tea ceremony, performing a tea ceremony is meant to be this meditative act that connects to spirituality. And it's a very like silent, peaceful, calm um, experience to do, and is meant to promote that like the ideas of enlightenment of Buddhism. All right, that's our Japanese unit. Feel free to reach out and let me know if you have any questions.